Okay.
Okay. I will just wait a second to have people start coming into the session.
Correct, and I would like to remind everyone to mute their microphones while the videos are playing, please.
I'll just wait until 9:01. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. I am Marlene Lee of the Population Reference Bureau, the moderator and chair for this session. Our online chat and QA moderator is Nkechi Owu. Nkechi is an economist from the University of Ghana and a member of the scientific committee that helped to organize the conference. I'm going to briefly outline how the session will work and then go straight to introducing our presenters and videos. Welcome to the session on inequality at the second IUSSP Population Poverty and Inequality Conference. Many of our sessions focus on the intersection of health and inequality. Today, you're fortunate to have 3 papers with more of an in-depth view of inequality, particularly economic inequality, in 3 different contexts: Africa, Brazil, and Bolivia. The session format will be first, the paper authors will present their findings via a pre-recorded video. Each audience member can submit questions while these presentations are going on in the Q&A box. And the authors are also able to respond. Nkechi will advance the questions to various authors and they can respond. After each author's pre-recorded presentation, the speakers, each of them will have a turn to comment on another paper. They will serve as a discussant for another paper. And then we'll open the floor for question and answer discussion moderated by Nkechi Owu. Each author will have a chance to respond to questions from the floor and bring in the discussion points of some of the things they've already responded to. So without further ado, let us move forward to the presentations. Our first presenter is Anda David, a research officer at the Agence Française de Développement, a co-sponsor of this conference. Her primary areas of interest, research interest are development economics, migration, labor, inequality, and aid. She will present the paper, Informality and Inequality, the African Case. Could you play the video, please?
Hello, everyone. Today, I will be presenting your work in progress, and it's joint work with Yoro Diallo at University Clermont-Auvergne and Björn Nilsson at University Paris-Saclay. So, as you probably know, the question of the informal sector is crucial in development economics. And it's also a double-sided question around which the narrative evolved from being seen as a curse for low and middle-income countries with low wages and low productivity to being praised as a potential engine for growth, especially in the context of demographic dividend and high flexibility. And actually, both of these views are valid, as the informal sector is a rational choice for some individuals and a solution of last resort for others. We also know that the informal sector is highest in Africa, but it has been decreasing rapidly, especially in a context of economic growth and decreasing poverty. So what we're interested in this paper is to understand whether this decrease in the level of the informal sector has also impacted inequality. And the reason why we focus on the income distribution in Africa is that Africa is slowly becoming the continent where not only poverty is concentrated, but also inequality, and that labor markets have been shown to play a crucial role in shaping the income distributions around the continent. So, what are the rationales behind these linkages? First of all, by offering a means of subsistence to those excluded from the formal labor market, an expansion of the informal sector could reduce inequality. However, given that it is generally a low value-added sector, its decrease can also reduce inequality if the poor get access to formal jobs. Also, an increase in the size of the informal sector also translates into a shrinking fiscal access, which reduces the capacity to redistribute and therefore increases inequality. To add complexity to the matter, inequality can also shape the size of the informal sector, as not only it is known that in highly unequal economies, credit constraints are stronger, thus fueling informality, but also there's a stronger demand for informal sector goods and a lower willingness to pay taxes. All these effects can come at play at the same time, and the causal direction is influenced by factors such as labor market institutions and social protection. And redistribution is key to this relationship, as depending on its nature and breadth, it can flip the relationship between inequality and informality. In terms of evidence, there is no clear agreement, but many studies in low and middle income countries also show a positive correlation between informality and inequality, like the seminal paper of Chad and Gradstein. However, the evidence is scarce for Africa, as the literature focuses mainly on inequality or just on informality. So what do we know about informality in Africa, and how do we measure it? Ideally, we would use household or firm data, but the studies using it are very few, because there are very few surveys around these issues in Africa. As a response, many alternative measures have been developed, and in the first part of this paper, we use the MIMIC data, which uses a methodology of multiple effects and multiple causes, making use of the association between the effects of an unobserved variable and the observable causes. This gives us a panel of 158 countries that span from 1991 to 2015. And what we see from the data is a steady decrease in the size of the informal sector across regions. And we do see that the informality rates are highest in sub-Saharan Africa. Now, these trends do hide a quite high heterogeneity across within the regions. So when we plot the data at the level of the countries, we do see that informality is quite concentrated in a few countries in Africa, and that it has been decreasing over the last decade. So has this increase in formalization translated into an expansion of social protection and redistribution? As a baseline, we know that 80% of the African population is not covered by any social protection schemes. And we see that there is a very slight increase in the social protection expenditures across the continent, although the picture is that of polarization, with African countries in the south and the north of the continent being more advanced on this issue. A dual picture also appears when we look at inequality, in the sense that inequality is concentrated in the south of the continent. And in order to look at inequality, we use two data sets here. We'll only be presenting the results using the SWID data set, but in the paper we constantly make use of the width data from UNU-WIDER in order to test the results, and the results are pretty much similar. So the picture that we see is this high inequality in the south of the continent, and it decreases as we advance towards the north. So when we look at the joint relationship between inequality and informality, we see that there's this decrease in informality, but we do not see such a decrease in inequality. So when we plot them one against the other, we find a very slight negative relationship. And when we plot the quadratic prediction, we find an inverse U shape. But again, no clear pattern emerges even when we look at the predictions at the country level. So we try to estimate this relationship, controlling for GDP and the Human Development Index. And to do that, we have to group the data into 5-year periods and then compute the averages. And the results are significant and show a positive relationship between the informal share of the economy and the inequality, either measured for the market income or the disposable income. Interestingly, we also find a positive correlation between the level of inequality and wealth. And in order to account for the endogenous nature of informality with regards to inequality, we also conduct a GMM regression, and the results are similar. So we further incorporate redistribution. In the paper, we measure it with two proxies, either as the difference between the Gini of the disposable income and the market income, or through the World Bank CPEI social protection rating. And in 3 out of the 4 estimations, the coefficients are not significant for social protection. So what we find in this first part of the paper is that the size of the informal sector seems to impact inequalities, and a decrease in the informal sector should lead to a decrease in inequality, while redistribution does not seem to play any role with regards to this relationship. And the way we interpret this is through 2 mechanisms. First of all, the level of social redistribution is still very low in Africa, with low coverage and low efficiency. And secondly, family and network-based solidarity often replace state-led solidarity, therefore leaving a very limited place for redistribution. Now, given the high heterogeneity that we observed, we also conduct an analysis using data on 7 West African capitals. And for this, we use a survey conducted in the PARSTAT project. The survey was conducted between 2001 and 2003 using a 1-2-3 methodology, which allows us to clearly identify informal and formal incomes. A first look at the data actually tells us that, as it might have been expected, the Ginis are lower for the informal sector, for informal incomes, than for formal ones. So the hypothesis that we will test is whether gaining access to formal income changes the overall income equally along the income distribution. And in order to do so, we rely on an unconditional quantile regression based on a recentered inference functions, which measure actually the influence of a dependent variable on the desired distributional outcome. What we find is that having access to formal incomes matters less and less as one moves up the income distribution. And when we plot this for each capital, we find the same relationship, except for Lomé, where we also find the highest share of informality, for instance. So to conclude, In this paper, we look at the relationship between income inequality and informality around the continent. We focus also on social redistribution as a potential link between the two phenomena. And what we find is very high heterogeneity, but also a positive relationship between informality and inequality, with less informality leading to less inequality. And we find no effect of social redistribution. This is also appears in other studies such as that of Borat, who finds no impact of social distribution on inequality. Our results are also confirmed by micro-level data for 7 African capitals. But of course, the pending question remains why we do not observe a fall in inequality. And a potential answer might be that we need to go beyond earnings inequality and probably look also at wealth inequality. Thank you.
Thank you, Anda. That was a very informative presentation, and I look forward to the discussion later. Right now, I'd like to introduce our second presenter. Marcelo Neri is director and founder of the Center for Social Policies at the Getulio Vargas Foundation. He also teaches at the FGV School of Economics, and he writes regularly in scientific journals and in general magazines. He will present a paper on what are the main drivers of Brazilian income distribution changes in the new millennium with an extended decomposition methodology, including demographic factors. Could you play the video, please? Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to join this Population, Poverty, and Inequality second conference. What I'm going to present here is a paper on Brazilian income distribution done by many hands. This is part of a UNO-wider-led project called Inequality in the Developing Giants that also includes countries like China, India, Mexico, South Africa. So this is work done by these many hands. It's basically, we have 6 papers plus the synthesis. Each paper addressed one measurement issue, and the synthesis try to get the main lessons of this period. I will go into detail as we move along into these different approaches. The common feature between these different approaches used here is that we look jointly at inequality, meaning social welfare. That is, we look at the second moment of the Brazilian income distribution without losing sight of the first moment. This is the first general feature. And the second one is that we look not only in terms of levels, but particularly in terms of changes of these 3 dimensions across time. Measurement and causal issues that affect inequality should also have effects or implications on the mean and vice versa. So if you look at them jointly, you have more information to address measurement puzzles that are brought in the analysis. Difference across time are a way to deal with also measurement issues and to identify causality, and it makes it easier to compare different data sets and periods of analysis. So as you all know, Brazil has one of the highest inequality Gini's around the world using household surveys. And the issue here is what other data sets can add to what we see in the household surveys measurements. So the first question here is, what are the formal labor registries show? This is not very usually, people don't use very much these labor registers, although they are very high quality. They have like 30 million observations each year. And so basically here we divide by percentile. We show the cumulative growth and curves for each percentile, and basically the lower percentile, like the 10th percentile, is on the higher parts, and as you move to the top of the income distribution up to the 90th percentile, we see that the cumulative growth curves are below. But this goes until the 9th percentile, which is this brown one here. When you move up this, it kind of bounces back. So as you move to the 95, 99, and 99.9 percentiles, the growth is the cumulative growth is higher. So in spite of the fact that Gini index using this data set or using the household surveys are similar, this data set allows us to see more into detail this top end of income distribution, and we see that this concentration at the top. Another possibility allowed by this labor register is to estimate what are the causes of these distributive changes, some specific variables. And the main message here is that firms' fixed effects are key to explain that. So here we show from a simple regression framework applied to different education levels. Let's focus on the college graduates. So the first social demographics explain around 21% of Brazilian inequality. If you take into account occupation and sector, it jumps another 15 percentage points. But when you incorporate firms' fixed effects, it jumps another 40 percentage points. So the message here is that firms' effects are even more important than education, about twice. If you use a tile decomposition, that's something we also do in one of the papers. And education, of course, is important, but we should look at other things, because education usually explains something like 30% of total inequality. So the bigger part is not explained, and firms' fixed effects play a good role to explain this remainder part of income inequality. Talking about education, we don't have very often information on the education of the parents for adults, and we did have two pictures on that in this period of following income inequality. When we do the cohort effects, we see first that the intergeneration inertia of education goes down from 0.7. The 70% of the sons' level of education is explained by their parents' levels of education. Went from 70 to 0.5 in 18-year period. And but the data here shows across cohort that this is a process going on continuously across time. So there are good news, but still a very high level of intergenerational inertia in terms of transmission of education. When we take into account these parents' education background and income measurement problems that we use as an instrument, who reported the income to try to identify this problem, what we see is a fall of education premium, the mean education premium. But what the graph shows, two things. First, it's very important to look at the whole distribution, because although the mean has fallen, the fall was concentrated in the middle. For example, college education returns, education premium didn't change at all. And as in the lower part, also similar. So it was like a middle of the distribution of education effect. And the second lesson we take from this exercise is that very important to take into account, they do affect a lot the results, the omitted variable bias, and also the attenuation bias related to measurement error. So this makes a difference if you do that or if you don't take into account these elements. So education is a second important aspect of or driver of this income inequality fall. We use here in most of the literature as well the PNAD, which is the National Household Surveys, which is the only survey that doesn't take into account missing imputation procedures for missing and new incomes. So we develop a technique to do that, combining regression and a stochastic component with some nice features. But when we apply that, we see that the answer to the question is no. It's not affected. The results are not affected by these missing income or imputation procedures used to address this problem. Brazilian surveys are not very good in terms of detail, different cash transfers and aggregation, and in particular, it does not incorporate good information, detail, not even very detailed information on direct taxes, on indirect taxes. So we do a micro simulation model to do this imputation using registries, and the main feature here is that we use 2 points in time. This has not been done for Brazil using 2 points in time. So what this exercise shows us is that first, cash transfers, in particular programs like Bolsa Familia, are very effective in terms of inequality fall and mean growth at a low fiscal cost. Direct and indirect taxes in terms of changes play the opposite role. They play against the growth of social welfare. But overall, if you compare gross income based inequality measures with disposable income based inequality measures, they are not very different across them. This is good news for the previous literature. And so basically what we do is divide it in little pieces, the impact of different income sources, different taxes, not only in terms of inequality, but also in terms of the mean. So we can construct the social welfare impact, compare the cost effectiveness of different measures in this period. And overall, about 70% of Brazilian social welfare growth was explained by income growth, mean income growth, 30% about inequality fall. This doesn't change from cross to disposable income concepts. And one important message is that the Brazilian case, inequality is falling as it was falling all over Latin America during this same period. But mean income growth is a particular issue of the Brazilian case. It's much higher than GDP growth, for instance, and this is specific of the Brazilian case. When we do the last point about top incomes impacts using personal income taxes data to substitute the top end of household surveys distribution following Thomas Piketty and others procedures. What these exercise do is first, by construction, inequality is higher when you do this substitution, but mean income and social welfare levels are also higher. The issue here is what happened to the movement of these measures across time. So there is a very bad news. When you incorporate these top incomes, you get a much lower inequality fall. But there are two good news. The first one is that growth is much faster if you do this combination. The mean growth is much faster. And the second effect actually dominates the first one, the inequality, the reduction of inequality fall. So what the paper does is try to address different causes for that. We think we find we don't have to throw away household surveys and PIT data. They do a good job together. It's possible to reconcile and understand. But the main message, as this graph shows, is that if you believe you have a lower inequality fall, or even inequality increase, you had a faster income growth effect. So this is the main message. Here are the different papers I address here, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcelo, for a very interesting paper. I think we are all going to be excited by the discussion of this combination of papers. Let me introduce our third presenter, Werner Hernani Limarino is a founder and distinguished research fellow at the ARU Foundation, which is an independent and plural nonprofit organization that develops research for public policies with commitment to produce and promote high quality applied research from global tools and to inform public policy. Currently, he's also a research fellow at the Partnership for Economic Policy in Nairobi, Kenya, and he's previously worked with the World Bank and at the Inter-American Development Bank. So we'll move to his presentation on unraveling declining income inequality in Bolivia. Do government transfers matter? Could you play the video, please?
Well, hello, my name is Werner Hernani Limarino. I'm gonna present a study that attempts to unravel the causes of the declining income inequality in Bolivia, and the paper is entitled "Do Government Transfers Matters?" This is a joint work with Ahmed. Just to give you some preview of what I'm going to talk about, first I'm going to present some context, then I'm going to present the research project questions and objectives, then the data and methodology, and finally some research results and key findings. Well, the context. Well, inequality is a very pervasive characteristic of Latin America in general and in Bolivia in particular. Research findings on other countries in Latin America identified two main contributors to the decline in observed inequality during the 2000s. One is the decline in earning gaps between high-skilled and low-skilled workers, and the other is the increase in government transfers to the poor. For example, the program of Jefes and Jefas de Hogar in Argentina, or Bolsa Escola, Bolsa Familia en beneficio de prestação continuada in Brazil, or the famous Progresa Oportunidades in Mexico. The point I'm just trying to make is that sometimes the contribution of the government transfers in these countries is incorrectly extrapolated to other countries or contexts for which there's no evidence that they were successful. This graph presents the evolution of the Gini index of inequality. The red line is the Bolivian evolution, and the blue line is the Brazilian income inequality evolution. As you can see, the decline in income inequality is much more high in Bolivia than in Brazil, and that's what's motivated us to study what's going on. So this project attempts to answer the question of what are the proximate and ultimate determinants of the inequality decline in Bolivia. There are two types of proximate determinants there. One is how much can be attributed to effective social assistance to the poor, that is government intervention, and how much is due to labor market causes. Within the labor market, you can also ask how much is due to changes in the structure of participation and employment, and how much is due to changes in the distribution of hourly wages. Again, within the hourly wage distribution, you can ask how much is due to changes in productive characteristics, observable or not, and how much is due to changes in prices. The big question that I'm going to talk about in this presentation is what is the source of the price changes in the labor market. The data, well, I use the official time series of cross-sectional household surveys for the period 1999 to 2011. We use raw data before any cleaning and imputation procedures were applied. We have tried to use a uniform definition of income aggregates. We adjust for difference in sampling schemes. And the interesting part of this period is that it covers two political timeframes. One is the so-called neoliberal period from 1999 to 2005, and the other is the so-called socialist period from 2006 to 2011. The method is the well-known decompositions of per capita family income. Here you have the Y is the per capita family income, and here you have all the sources of the per capita family income, which are from labor, from government transfers, from inter-household transfers, from property, and from social security and other income. Then we construct a synthetic individual at the percentile level, and then we perform counterfactual simulations, keeping a lot of the factor constant and just varying each one by one. The set of graphs that I'm going to present are the evolutions of the Gini income, comparing the observed evolution, which is the solid line, with the evolution that would have prevailed if only one of the factors would change, in this case, the inter-household transfers. As you can see, if only inter-household transfers would change, it seems that nothing would have changed with the evolution of inequality. The same happened with the income from properties. The evolution wouldn't have changed if only the income from rents would have varied in this period. The same is true for social security contributions. The same is true for government transfer. This is a very important result, because when you hear about the decline in inequality in Bolivia, most people think that government transfer is a big part of the answer. And what this simple simulation is showing is that nothing would have happened with inequality if only government transfer would have changed from the neoliberal period to the socialist period. Why? Well, the answer is very simple. Is the two main programs are the Bono Pancito Pinto, which is a so-called conditional cash transfer for people who attend public school, which is progressive. For example, around 70% of the benefits go to the 50% more poor. And the other one is a non-contributory pension to people who are above 60 or above 65, depending on whether they are women or men, which is regressive. As you can see in this graph, 40% of the total benefits go to the 50%. the 15% poorest in the population. And the big irony is that the transfer, which is progressive, is almost not important for anyone. This graph shows the percentage of income that represents the transfer for each of the quantiles of the distribution. And as you can see, for 95% of the population, these transfers mean almost nothing. On the other hand, the regressive transfer is very important, as you can see here. For example, for the poorest, it represents almost 50% of their income. Well, if the government transfers did not explain the change in income inequality, then by default, what is explaining the change in income inequality in Bolivia is the labor market. As you can see here, if only the labor market incomes change, we can almost reproduce the evolution of the income inequality in Bolivia. So the next question is, what explains the changes in the labor market income in Bolivia? And you can see here that you can decompose further the labor market income into what can be attributed to changes in participation, to what can be attributed to changes in employment, what can be attributed to changes in wages, and what can be attributed to changes in the number of hours worked. Again, doing by the same principles, changing only one of these indicators at a time. If we have changed only the participation rate, the income inequality would be constant. If we have changed only the number of hours worked, again, the income inequality would have been constant. And if we would have changed the employment rate, the income inequality would have been constant or increase a little bit. The big change is in hourly wages. Hourly wages explain a lot of what has happened with income inequality. And if you try to decompose this further using the well-known John Murphy and Pierce, or as the composition or the Mealy quantile version of this decomposition, well, what you get is that these are not the Gini index anymore. This is the 90 to 10 percentile log wage difference. And what you can see here is that a lot is explained in prices, not so much in quantities. This is for male, this is for female. Again, you see a drop in the prices. And when you do much more complex decompositions, you kind of get the same result, a big drop in prices and nothing happening with quantities, a big drop in prices and nothing happening with quantities. Well, just to summarize their results, the key findings are that only changes in the labor earnings were associated with inequality changes. Government transfers did not help, mainly because they were universal and unconditional in practice. From the labor market components decomposition, we can see that only changes in hourly wages seems to matter, and this can be attributed mostly to changes in prices. Thank you.
Thank you, Werner. It's a very interesting addition, and now we'll move to taking comments on the papers. I had wanted to start with you, Werner, if you're okay with that. Since you were the last paper presenter, I thought maybe you could start the comments and start with your comments on Anda's paper.
Sure.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Could you turn on your video?
Sure. Okay. Yeah, on Anda's paper, I read it. I found it very interesting and with very challenging questions about the relationship between informality, the share of the informal sector in Africa, and inequality. I would like to skip the details on methodology that I would forward to Anda, and I would like to push one like conceptual point, and the conceptual point is related to the types of informality that exist in the world, in particular in Africa, and the types of inequality that exist in different countries. There's a different, well, there are many different definitions of informality. For example, how you treat a self-employed worker as informal sector in a household survey, and how you treat a very big firm that does not pay taxes, or maybe it's not registered officially. And these are very different types of informality that I'm not sure how you're treating, and that are very important because their impact on inequality is very different too. And there's also difference in inequality because, for example, as using our countries, Brazil and Bolivia, the types of inequality that are driving the Gini's are very different. As in the case of Bolivia, for example, the inequality was mostly explained because there were a lot of very poor people. In the case of Brazil, the inequality is different because inequalities explain mainly, at least from my reading, Marcelo might correct me or not, because there are a lot of very rich people. So you can have like the same Gini indexes around, I don't know, 50 something at the beginning of the century, and very different types of inequalities, and which require very different policies. And the same happens with informalities. Like you can have very same shares of informal economies with very different types of informal sectors. And I think in the case of a continent as diverse as Africa,
Werner, you have frozen. Maybe turn off your video. I think we have lost Werner, and we will wait for him to reconnect. But in the interim, I believe it's possible to move on to the next discussant and have Anda speak about Marcelo's paper. Anda?
Okay, great. Thank you, Marlene. Marcelo, it's really a very, very interesting paper, very rich. And as you guys have seen from the presentation, it's also the result of various papers. And I think one of my first questions was, how do you want to take this paper further? Because when I first read it, I just wanted to go and read the other papers as well. So that's also a good point. So my questions will mostly be more in terms of contextualization and maybe linking it a bit more to the other papers, or expanding it a little bit as to provide some insights in areas that might not have been touched upon, and it was probably voluntary in the other papers. And maybe the first thing that interested me, and I didn't find it in the paper as such, and it's also linked to my paper, is this issue of informality. Because you talk a lot about the labor market and the formal labor market, but I think it would be interesting to know what is the share of the formal labor market, what is the share of the formal sector as a whole, or the share of the formal firms, for instance. And then how do these dynamics come into play in terms of earnings? And this is a question that was also asked in the chat on the firm's characteristics, because one of the very interesting findings is the significant role played by firm characteristics in the earnings inequality. So you do sketch some of them in the paper, in terms of size, for instance, and sector, but you don't tell us what are those. So which are the sectors, for instance, that lower inequality, or what is the limit or the threshold size that would of a firm that would lower inequality? I think that would be quite interesting to bring into the discussion. And then in terms of the schooling, again, these are very interesting effects that you highlight. And if I understood correctly, the expansion of the years of schooling is crucial for the faster increase in the bottom 40, for instance. But then you also find a decrease in the returns of schooling, and you mentioned that there is no evolution, there's no increase or anything in terms of productivity. So I was just wondering, how do you link these two, these huge evolutions in terms of education and its impact on poverty, but then we find nothing in terms of productivity? And then I have two other questions. One of them is related to the last exercise of microsimulations, because what I was wondering was if you have also tried to monetize the value of the social services such as education and health, and add them as indirect effect, a bit like the colleagues from the Commitment to Equity Institute are doing in their full methodology. And another question I had was on the issue of perceptions, because we live in a world in which the perceptions of inequalities are extremely important and very often disconnected from reality. So in a context like the Brazilian one, where inequality has declined, what are people's perceptions? Do they perceive this decline or not? So I will stop here and give the floor back to you, Marlene.
Thank you, Anda. Very similar questions to what I had, and let us now move on to Marcelo's comments on Werner's paper.
Is Werner is not back yet, is he?
He is not back yet. I sent him an email and haven't gotten a response.
Okay.
This is being recorded, I think, so.
No, sure. And my comments, I wrote a small report and sent him. So, but let me 1 second. So let me read here. It's easier. So general comments. I think it's a very neat contribution. The paper is a very nice paper. First, a wise choice of an implementation of techniques, especially in a especially relevant episode. According to Antoniatti, a 3-point variation of the Gini is a big movement, independent of the time. And we are talking here of 11-point Gini change in 6 years. So it's huge. And we have already books, not only papers, but books about the fall of income inequality in Brazil or in Latin America in the 2000s. And Bolivia turns out to be the main one. So I think it's a very interesting point. And, you know, Latin America, the most unequal continent in the world, together with Southern Africa, perhaps, is, but the continent as a whole, is inequality was falling, and Bolivia is the one, and this is something shown in this paper, was the most significant fall of inequality. I think that there is this very neat decomposition that he applies, disentangling different pieces of what explains inequality fall. And the main message is that government transfers is not what is behind this inequality change. What I felt was, you know, in the paper, and I'm not the person who should be saying that, because we just saw a paper with 6 different techniques, data sets, etc. And but this paper, it's like 2 papers in one. There is like a division in the middle, you know, in the end. The last effect, Werner uses a different measure of inequality for good reasons, and instead of the Gini as he used before, and a different technique, not only this Barros type of methodology that he used up to the labor division, the final part of the labor decomposition. And so he changed the methodology, the index, and changed the methodology. And my suggestion would be to go one step further with this Barros technology, and because when you're dealing with labor ingredients, you're basically dividing and multiplying by some same term. So you get, you know, the participation, the occupation among the economic active population, etc. And I think so that the composition of hourly wages, which is the main driver of the whole movement, according to the paper, is you could split that into terms of in terms of not hourly wages by years of education and years of education. And I think this is also a very important driver of income distribution, not in the whole Latin America. So I think government transfers is important. Education premium, schooling premium is also key. And he disagrees with the first in the Bolivian case. He agrees with the second in the Bolivian case. But there is a third component, which is the increase of access to education. And this was very pro-poor. And so I think the methodology could benefit. I put here just a slide, you know, some data from Brazil as an example. You know, you can, the main driver of inequality fall is government transfers, but also education, not only in terms of the premium, but in terms of the quantity. The quantity increased much faster, 4 times faster in the case of Brazil, and similar results for Latin America, than in the top 10%, for instance. So my main suggestion here is to use to extend the methodology. And I think the last part, which he used this GMP, I think should be another paper, and a very neat paper. But I think this, I think it has this very important result, and if the suggestion is accepted, the paper would say something. What are the roles of government policy in general, including not only transfers, which is a very neat result of Werner's paper, but also education. education quantity, not only the premium of education. So this would be the main point. So the quality of Bolivian growth, given the results, that's labor income, would be more sustainable. And this is suggested by recent social and political developments in Bolivia. Bolivia seems to be a quite a very solid case in terms of income inequality fall still these days, which unfortunately I cannot say about other Latin American countries, my country in particular. And but at the same time, and I have some data on that here, you have the commodity price booms, and the most important export of Bolivia is natural gas exports, and this rise in the prices of natural gas. So maybe the labor market performance is not moved, it's not fueled by a sustainable ingredient. But as I said, I think the recent evidence show that perhaps this is not the case. It's quite solid. So I think it's a very neat paper, and my main suggestion is try to go into the quantity of education effects, which I think is one of the three most important inequality fall drivers in Latin America and in Latin America in this period. But I think it's a very, very interesting contribution, very relevant. And last but not least, the paper extends the series of Bolivia. There is a famous data set in Latin America, the SEDLAC data set. And so the paper adds to that data from Bolivia. Bolivia was restricted to up to 2007 or something. So this, I think, is a simple but not less important contribution of the paper.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. And if you could stop sharing your screen, then we could get the paper presenters back. I would like to have Anda address the comments that were and questions asked of her. And Nkechi, I'm sorry, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Marlene. Marcelo, I believe you're still sharing your screen.
Sorry, I'm a bit. Is it okay now? No.
No, if the host can help, sometimes.
Sure. Okay, sorry.
Thank you very much. Okay, well then at this point, yes, I agree with you, Marlene. Let's have the speakers quickly respond to some of the discussants' comments. And then afterwards, we'll take one or two questions from the floor as time permits. And would you like to start?
Yes. Well, given that my discussant got disconnected, I just wanted to stress that indeed we wanted to add a discussion in the paper on the types of informality and the types of inequality, but we do try to limit the scope around informality in the labor market. And when we look at the macro level, the size of the informal sector. And in terms of inequality, we just focus on income inequality because we have the data for it. And we don't dwell too much into the drivers, but one of the things that we wanted to highlight in the paper is the heterogeneity across Africa and the need to have country studies that would allow us to go into the mechanisms, which we can't do at the level of the continent. And maybe just to respond very quickly on two of the questions that were asked. So in terms of excluding Southern Africa, what we did do that actually in the paper, we ran also the regressions without the countries that had the highest inequality, and in the database, those are of course the countries in the south of the continent, but also Algeria and Equatorial Guinea, I think, and the results are similar both in terms of significance and of size. So we don't find a huge effect of having the countries with high inequality in the data. So these are not what drive the results, and that's a good thing. In terms of consumption versus income, we do not have a usable database of consumption equality across the continent. But what we do know is that consumption equality is lower than income inequality. So what could probably happen is that our results are lower or they disappear for income consumption. What we would like to do in a more advanced version of the paper is, at least for some of the countries that have both, try to conduct this analysis. So Ivory Coast is an example, and we want to try to also do that for South Africa and for Mali. With regards to gender, I have said that we haven't looked at all into the gender issue. The main reason is also that we use, for the second part of the paper, we use household data. So the only thing that we could look at is the decomposition in terms of male-headed households and female-headed households, but we could think about maybe adding gendered variables. So thank you for that, because we hadn't thought about it. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your responses, Anda. And I'm going to move over to Marcelo now. So could you respond to some of the discussant comments, and then I can read a few of the questions that have come through for you as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Marlene. Thank you very much, Anda. Very interesting comments. The issue of the plan for the paper, it's going to be part of a book that's being published by our Murray and others. It's just come out. And I'm relieved, because I think it's a very hard paper, because there's so much stuff into that. And the only advantage is that you can compare with other big countries like China, South Africa. So I think that's the right place for the publication. About the issue of informality, that we didn't explore much in the paper. I think it's a very good question. I think if I were to say, what was this period in terms of Brazil? What was the main characteristic? The first would be inequality fall. The second would be informality fall. Fell like 2 percentage points. The share of people who didn't contribute to Social Security rose by 2 percentage points every year. And this is part of the results on the PIT, the puzzles, is explained by falling informality. You're not measuring the same thing when you're comparing across time. And I think a very important characteristic of this period, that inequality fell, informality fell. So you have higher share of the population is earning higher because they are formal. But the big increase of income, the biggest increase, was in the informal sector. So this is, so they get the big rises of income. That's what explains, and goes back to the point I was talking to Werner, that premium of education fell, different from other, but education levels also increased. So this combination, that's what makes the inequality fall. Relevant. And one last issue is, what is behind that is something that no one expects, is minimum wage. Minimum wage in Brazil affects the informal sector more than the formal sector. They follow the law because you can take to the labor courts if for informal workers. So I think this is a very interesting area to be explored. And the second question, I'm going to answer here. There are other ones, but it's another feature that, and the capture in the Brazilian case, we had a big education rise, but no productivity growth. This is very shocking in the case. That's the main problem of the country, and perhaps because we are thinking about quantity of education. In Brazil, if you say 4 hours in school and that's it, and our lema was all kids in school, and we did that for certain age groups, but with a very low bar, very low hours of education. So, so I think capture a second very important characteristic in the Brazilian case.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. I do believe you have two other questions, I think that Marlene had asked. So there's one question that says, what is the social explanation of the decline in inertia of intergenerational education? And she's wondering whether it's the increased access to education regardless of income.
I think it's good to answer that because it's close to the previous question, which is somewhat connected, which is, Brazil, we have this universal education. So the result is quite shocking. 70% of all education levels of kids is explained by their parents. So it's very frustrating. It went down to 50 because of this diffusion of education. But as we were discussing, but this didn't have, and this is the big problem in Brazil. People are more educated, but productivity is stagnated. So is education without productivity. This is a huge problem. And of course, education causes, infant mortality, life expectancy to rise. You have a lot of social. So I think Brazil is good socially speaking, but economic is not a sustainable model. And we have seen that in these last periods. And the second question, if you allow me, of Marlene, which is somewhat connected to that, I think is why firms' effects is so important. I'm gonna answer, say why they are not important. Once again, it's not productivity. You saw a fall of inequality, and this fall of inequality is not connected to the fundamentals in terms of productivity distribution. And once again, what some papers show is that the minimum wage is one explanation. So it's kind of worrying, the Brazilian case, is that there was this huge fall of inequality, but this is not connected with productivity distribution. So maybe it's not sustainable in the long run. And of course, if you have a variable like firms' effects, where you have 100,000, you consume a lot of observations, you consume a lot of degrees of freedom to estimate that. But I think this is a kind of a direction that the literature has shown in Brazil and other countries. So that's the advantage of having these this formal registry of labor used to estimate these firm effects.
Okay, thank you very much for those responses, Marcelo. Well, in the absence of any more questions and comments from panelists and attendees, I'm pleased to bring this session to a close. And before I do, I would like to remind you that there will be a virtual Meet the Author session immediately after this, where we are all welcome to interact with the speakers some more on their very interesting findings. So I'd like to thank all of you, the panelists, the speakers, the audience, for your questions, your contributions. And with your permission, Madam Chair, I believe the session is now closed. Thank you very much.